Tony Northrup just released a really interesting video on ISO, and in today's video, we're going to be putting some of his claims to the test. So if you'd like to learn more about the history of ISO and all the details of how your camera works, I highly suggest checking out Tony's video. It was really, really well done. It's also super interesting information. In his video, he makes some very interesting claims. Some of them I completely agree with, and some of them I don't disagree with, but I just didn't really know this information. And so today I want to put some of those claims to the test. But let's start with the beginning. His first claim was that ISO used to be an industry standard to measure film speed, but now with digital cameras, there's really no standard at all, and camera manufacturers differ wildly when it comes to ISO. I would completely agree with that, and we have seen that to be the case with our own tests. I remember a couple years ago, we tested a Nikon versus a Sony camera, and we found that Sony was exaggerating their ISO numbers to make it seem like their camera had better ISO performance, when in reality, it was almost identical to the Nikon. So the next claim that Tony made was that not only is ISO changing amongst camera brands, but it's changing within one camera brand as you change camera models. What this means is that some camera manufacturers might be releasing new cameras that have very similar ISO performance, but by changing the numbers and changing what actually shows up in the ISO field on the camera, it appears like you're getting better ISO performance. Now, we don't have every camera brand to test here, but I do have one very interesting camera that we can use for this test. This is the Nikon D1H. This is one of the first DSLRs that Nikon ever made, and I'm going to put this to the test versus the Nikon D750 and then the newer D850. So I have this still life set up here. I'm gonna be shooting with the D1H first, and my settings are ISO 400, 2.8, 1/30th of a second. All right, let's get the D750. Now I've got the D750 here, and before I even take a picture, the meter in this camera is telling me that I am overexposed by 1 stop before I even snap the picture. So this seems like the opposite of what Tony was saying, because this much newer camera, the ISO 400 is acting like ISO 800 on the other camera. Keep in mind, we haven't actually looked at the files yet, but the meter itself is showing 1 stop difference. All right, let's see if the Nikon D850 has the same exposure as the 750. All right, the D850 is giving me an identical meter reading to the D750. I would hope so, or my mind would be blown. Let's take a shot here, and then let's go on the computer and see what all these files look like. So when we get into Photoshop, we are seeing the same results that I saw on the camera. The Nikon D1H is the only one that's properly exposed, and then with the exact same camera settings, the D750 and the D850 look identical, and they are 1 stop overexposed. This is the opposite of what Tony thought might happen. He was theorizing that camera manufacturers are exaggerating ISO numbers with newer cameras to make it appear like they have better ISO performance when in fact they do not. Obviously, I can't speak about all camera brands, but with this Nikon test, we're actually finding the opposite to be true. The Nikon D1H at ISO 400 was darker than the D750 and the D850. Tony had one more theory, and that was that the sensor is not changing in any way as you change the ISO. It's just a digital signal or gain boost. I completely agree with that, but he claimed that you could shoot at any ISO and just boost the exposure in post like Lightroom or Photoshop and get an identical photograph with an identical amount of noise. So let's go back over to our little set here. Let's shoot with the Nikon D850 and let's see if this is the case. Now, Photoshop allows us to push a RAW file 5 stops in camera raw. So if we go from 100 to 200 to 400 to 800 to 1600 to 3200. So for this first shot, I'm just trying to get a correct exposure at ISO 3200, and my camera settings are f2.8 because I don't want the aperture to change at all in between shots, at 1/320th of a second at ISO 3200. Let's take a shot. Of course, on the back of the screen, we have a correct exposure here. Now what I'm going to do is drop the ISO down to 100. And we'll take the exact same shot. and I expect it to be almost completely black. It is. Let's see if we can bring this file back to life in Photoshop. All right, so let's do this. I'm gonna do this live on camera. I just expect that it's going to be grainier because I assumed that something was happening when the camera bakes the raw file and actually saves it to the memory card. Adding gain at the sensor level or at the software level right here seemed like it was a different thing to me, but I am very happy to be proven wrong here. So let's see what happens. I'm gonna push this up. It looks pretty good. It looks pretty good with the exposure all the way up. Let's open it. I'm gonna stack it on top of the other one. When I stack both of these files on top of each other, I have to say they look very, very close. But if you start zooming in, there's some weird artifacts that you'll see. It looks like there's dust all over the black areas of this frame that are non-existent when I switch over to the Nikon file shot at 3200. Also, when you look at the noise in the background, there's a lot of color noise that does not exist in the file shot at 3200 ISO. So this just makes me wonder if there is some sort of processing going on before the raw file is actually written. It's right off the sensor. There's some sort of processing before it's saved, rather than the idea that a raw file is saved and then they just change some number in the code that says push this 5 stops or push this 10 stops when you open it on a computer. It doesn't seem to be that simple. That being said, I am not an engineer whatsoever. I do not know what is going on here. I have to say I'm very surprised by these results because they are so close, first of all, but they're not identical. If I had to choose which one of these files looks best, it is the Nikon file shot at ISO 3200. But when you're zoomed out and if you printed both of these files, you probably wouldn't be able to see these differences. I think this proves that for the most part, Tony was right. And if you happen to shoot an image that's wildly underexposed by 5 stops or 7 stops, as long as you were shooting at ISO 100, you can just boost the exposure and you're gonna get almost an identical final image as if you were shooting at ISO 3200 or 6400. I'm pretty shocked about that. Now, for everyone saying that it's identical and it will look the exact same, that is not the case. And then when we go back and look at our first test and the theory that new cameras have incorrect ISOs on purpose to make it seem like ISO performance is better, at least when it comes to Nikon, we have proven that is not the case. In fact, it's the opposite. For more free content just like this, head over to fstoppers.com. If you haven't seen Tony's original video on ISO, I definitely suggest checking it out. It's very well done. And if you'd like to learn from many of the best photographers in the world, head over to fstoppers.com/store.